My mother was abused as a child by adults that she knew. That fear left Mum in fear of the world she lived in. In 1981, Mum fell pregnant with me, aged just 16. She had just left a children's home because she was a child in care herself with very little support. That must have been a very, very difficult time for my mum. We now know that the stress hormone cortisol can be passed from the mother to the unborn child through the placenta during pregnancy. It would seem my mum's early life experiences were affecting my life before I was even born. Take a second to imagine the isolation and fear Mum must have felt having 5 children by the time she was 24 to 4 different men, all boys, none of whom stayed to help. I could certainly sense her fear when social services knocked on the door because she knew she was struggling to cope. In the time that social services worked with my family, there were 2 separate incidents of sexual abuse to children around me, and they uncovered that we were exposed to abuse, neglect, and unexplained harm. Social services then made the decision that Mum feared the worst, which was to take us into care. Can you imagine how it must feel to have your children taken away when you were in care yourself? I love my brothers and sisters dearly, but by the age of 7, I'd become violent towards them. I specifically remember an incident where I seriously hurt my baby brother, who was only 2 years old, and the sense of guilt that came over me immediately after. It wasn't just my mother's life experiences, but now it was my early life experiences that were shaping my neurological pathways and my ability to cope emotionally. I guess the question was at this point, how was I going to be helped to cope by my community and my educators? I have accessed my social care files and they state that I was displaying unusually aggressive behaviours at school and I was behind my peers academically and emotionally. I can remember this making me feel like I was different to the other kids in school because they were learning and I was too distracted to learn. Whilst in care, social services were continually asking me if I wanted to go home. I knew it wasn't safe at home and I was scared of the adults that Mum often had around. The problem was, I was also scared to say that I didn't want to go home because I felt a responsibility to keep my baby brothers and sisters safe. I guess my question is, can you imagine how confusing that is for a child? Upon returning home, I realised that social services had made the decision that I would be the first to return home because in my files it states that I was the most resilient child. The area that we moved back to was surrounded by crime and violence. Mum was always in need of adult company, and so she would often invite those involved in crime and violence into our home. Subconsciously, Mum was placing her social needs before our developmental and emotional needs. One of Mum's boyfriends was a criminal who used to use our house as somewhere to store his stolen goods. He would often wake me up at the early hours of the morning and take me out on his motorbike. This was even when he knew I had to be at school the following morning. He didn't care too much for education, and because he was showing me attention, he was starting to become my role model, so then I didn't care for education either. He also taught me that fear wasn't for men like us. A toxic misinterpretation of masculinity mixed with crime and violence. And the identity that my environment was creating for me was going to have problems later. By 11 years old, I was smoking cigarettes with the permission of the adults in my life. By 12 years old, I was given cannabis by another of Mum's partners. Instead of promoting my well-being or sending me to school, the adults in my life were providing me with drugs. Of course, he was only 19, he'd experienced trauma and care himself, and he didn't see his behaviour as inappropriate. In fact, he was a good man, so it would teach me to be the same was probably his interpretation. It wasn't just violence and fear that was shaping my childhood either. It was also instability and chaos. So by the time I'd reached 13 years old, I'd had 18 different family and foster homes. Every time we moved, we had to build relationships over and over again. And because I was growing up in a dysfunctional family, it meant that often the relationships that we're building with others were often children from other dysfunctional families. By the time I reached 15, I was so far behind in school, I just couldn't keep up with my peers. I decided to behave in a way that meant the teachers would send me home so that nobody would clock on to how stupid I felt. You see, it was very difficult to concentrate on Napoleon or Winston Churchill or even how to speak French, because these concepts were so far away from me meeting my basic needs as a child, which were to keep myself safe and to learn to deal with the events that were thrown at me on a daily basis as a family. School then decided that when I was in school, I was challenging, and so they excluded me. This just left me even more vulnerable, and so I started smoking heroin by the time my peers at school were studying for their exams. Just take a minute to imagine. My body hasn't even fully developed yet, and here I am, intoxicating myself with heroin to help me deal with the lack of self-worth and social rejection. The heroin seemed to offer me a sense of escapism from a traumatic and chaotic childhood and seemed to numb the pain, or at least for a short period. Another way fear had shaped my perspective was that just like Mum, I didn't seem to understand or recognise that I should fear certain people and the risk that they posed to me. An adult drug dealer capitalised on my vulnerability by persuading me to sell drugs for him. Let's face it, I had an heroin addiction at the moment and I was excluded from school, so I was the perfect target because I was completely unprotected. Eventually, I was caught in that drug dealer's car with a large amount of heroin, along with my baby brother who was 15. When I was released, that drug dealer persuaded me to go back to the police station and admit to them drugs being mine. I also had to return to selling heroin because I'd now lost a load of money to a more serious drug dealer. Now I realised I should have been in fear of getting into this situation, but it seemed to be too late. 2 weeks later, I was caught with another large amount of heroin and remanded to a young offenders institution. If things weren't bad enough, on the bus, on the way to the prison, the officers put the radio on. And on came the Spice Girls' Goodbye. This song, seriously, just made me sit in that cubicle and cry, because it made me realise the seriousness of my situation. So, I'm 17 years old just turned, I'm on my way to prison, I've got no friends, no education, and I'm about to withdraw from heroin. After everything that had already happened to me, if the criminal justice system, if their aim was to instill fear in me, as I'm sure you can imagine, I was terrified. I'd now been incarcerated, which meant that I'd gone through what I call the risk switch. I transitioned from a child that services viewed as a risk from others to an individual that services feared was at risk to others. The word rehabilitation in the dictionary is the action of restoring someone to health or normal life after imprisonment. So I beg the question, where was the prison experience in restoring me back to? Was it pre-birth? Was it age 7 when I went into care? How about maybe 15 when I was excluded from school? Or 16 when I was addicted to heroin? You see, the thing is, when I left custody, I went back to the very same family circumstances I was in pre-custody. All of my family have experienced similar life circumstances. None of us got through school. All of us have had drug and alcohol problems, and the 3 boys have experienced heroin addiction and custody. So this does indicate that my life circumstances are in the research. The more adversity you experience as a child, the more likely you are to have these negative outcomes. We also didn't have an attachment to a positive adult that could help mitigate against the experience. A well-thought-of Dutch psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk, states, "The parent-child connection is the most powerful mental health intervention known to mankind." I think it's fair to say I understand his point. Age 24, after experiencing abuse, neglect, violence, care, school exclusion, drug addiction, exploitation, and eventually 4 prison sentences, I decided I needed to face my fears and make improvements to my life. The question now was, what are my fears? I didn't really know until 2 years after release I started volunteering for Leeds Youth Justice Service. It then dawned on me that I feared being accepted by people that represented whatever it was to be normal. People that were happy, optimistic, caring, nurturing. People that would listen to my point of view. I didn't understand people like that, and not understanding them made me fear that they'd accept me. I also feared letting go of the very toxic relationships that had continually held me back from birth. We all have tools that help us in difficult times. For me, whilst in prison, a song by a woman called Kelly Price called "Love Sets You Free" helped me no end. Why? Because the lyrics to that song made me realise that before I learned to love other people, and certainly before I allowed other people to love me, I first had to love who? I first had to love myself. And you see, the criminal justice system isn't very good at helping you learn to love yourself, but that's a key element. Because I now had supported relationships and I'd learned to love myself, in 2011, I won an award in Leeds for creating programmes that help the most prolific and serious young offenders in my city to desist from offending. In 2013, I qualified in youth justice, me, and obtained a qualified position. I was no longer being supervised on probation. Now I'm qualified to keep the children in my city safe. I recently published a book that took me 10 years to write. It helped me reflect and ponder on my childhood experiences and the decisions and why I'd ended up in the criminal justice system. But it also helped me reflect on how we're responding to children like me as a society. If we consider that in 2016, 25%, 1 in 4, of the adult prison population had experienced care, and 42%, almost 1 in 2, have experienced school exclusion, it would seem that childhoods like mine are not unusual for adult prisoners. It seems to me that locking up children that have experienced toxic stress, complex trauma, and adverse childhood experiences just seems illogical, morally, socially, and economically. In 2010, the National Audit Office estimated that the reoffending rate for those leaving custody costs the taxpayer between 9.5 to 13 billion. That doesn't seem to be a good sense of spending money. If we truly embraced the findings from the Adverse Childhood Experiences research and implemented it into national policy to invest more time, resources and energy into our most disadvantaged communities, that would seem the right response socially, morally and economically. In the words of Frederick Douglass, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. If my life experiences have taught me anything at all, is that the most effective way to beat fear, marginalisation and social exclusion is with love, community and social inclusion. Thank you very much for listening.